Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Gavin Lee. Every Friday on France 24, reflecting on the biggest world events of the past 7 days with a panel of distinguished international correspondents. In a week that President Trump has declared eternal peace for the Middle East, being within reach as he stood side by side with Israel's Prime Minister to unveil a new peace plan for Gaza. One of the greatest days in civilization, the President said. Hostilities would cease immediately. Israeli troops would withdraw once all hostages were released by Hamas. The militants offered a possible amnesty, but no future in the Strip. A response needed within 72 hours, he said, now extended until Sunday night. The decision resting with the Hamas military leader in hiding inside Gaza.
Would have my full backing to finish the job of destroying the threat of Hamas, but I hope that we're going to have a deal for peace, and if Hamas rejects the deal, which is always possible, they're the only one left. Everyone else has accepted it, but I have a feeling that we're going to have a positive answer.
It's been a week that's seen the EU launch its defence plan in response to suspected Russian violations of NATO airspace. But the proposal for a drone war already has cracks. The name itself, for one. European leaders met in Copenhagen to discuss the idea of a defence system against future incursions. Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen floated the idea of, quote, an eastern flank watch. But EU leaders further away from Russia's borders are wary. France and Germany want the focus to be on continent-wide early warning systems that they're jointly creating. Greece, Italy, Belgium haven't thrown their weight behind it yet. And it was noted the Danish Prime Minister couldn't or wouldn't say the words drone war.
And perhaps Prime Minister Frederiksen, you can explain why you didn't use the term drone wall.
I don't really care about the name as long as it works.
And it's been a week that's seen parallel protests in Morocco and Madagascar, organised anonymously online on TikTok and Discord. 8,000 kilometres apart, the triggers of the unrest are different, but the themes are broadly the same. Youth-led, anti-government, demanding basic rights, water, energy and healthcare, and both inspired by earlier global GenZ demonstrations, which have been achieving profound change in Nepal and partial concessions in Kenya and Indonesia. All protests unified by one symbol, a Japanese manga-created flag, a skull and crossbones, signifying youth rebellion against alleged government corruption. Well, to talk about this and more alongside me on the panel this week, we have with me in Paris in the studio Vivienne Waltz, a long-time correspondent for Time and Fortune magazine, great friend of the programme as well. Great to have you here this evening. Good to see you, Viv. Let me ask you, what have you been working on this week?
Well, funnily enough, in a completely different vein, I was in Luxembourg interviewing the brand new Grand Duke who just got coronated today. And interestingly, you know, Europe has 12 monarchies. I was astonished to find. And there's broad acceptance for them, which I think is sort of a sad reflection of our political leadership right now, that people are sort of okay with unelected, hereditary heads of state in this modern continent that we live in.
So tell us about him. So out goes Henri, in comes Guillaume in his early 40s. Tell me about He's
probably going to be on the throne for a very long time. The new heir to the throne is 5 years old. So he's going to be around for a long time. He's, somewhat business-minded, trade representative, if you like. It's probably the closest thing they have to a trade representative. They are the richest country in the EU. They have a gigantic global financial industry, second only to New York City, believe it or not, and with less than 1 million people. So they are kind of this very strange little nation with some kind of a global role.
Is he a character? Is he media friendly? What sense of him do you get?
I'm not sure how media friendly he was. I believe I was the only English language interview of his new reign. So we'll have to see.
Brilliant. Great to hear. Vivian, lovely to have you with us tonight. Let's go to Kyiv, where we can join John Sweeney, investigative journalist, broadcaster, author of Killer in the Kremlin, and founder of the VPDFO Festival, soon to get underway in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, do F off. John, brilliant to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Before we get on to tonight's topic,
By the way, I'm going
Yes.
to put on my lucky orange hat because the moment I might get into trouble. So
Yes.
what we're doing is simply we're showing the middle finger like this to Vladimir Putin. I went to a rehab clinic in February, and I asked a guy called Anton, who'd lost both arms and a leg, so he's only got one leg left. What did he think to Trump? And he said, "Oh, by the way, Vivian was talking about what are all these monarchies in Europe. I prefer the King of England to Donald Trump, I have to say." But going back to the story, so I asked this guy, Anton, what's he think to Trump? He said, I want to be diplomatic. What do you think of Putin? And he'd only just had his kind of arm implant in. And so it takes an age. And he went, wait. And I thought, that's a symbol. And we've been running this festival. I was here during the Battle of Kyiv, and lots of journalists left, but I thought, I'm fed up with people in the West running away from Vladimir Putin and his killing machine, the Russian army. I'm sick of it. And all I needed was a hole in the ground and a bottle of whiskey. And now that very year, I set up on Putin's birthday, the Vladimir Putin Do Fuck Off Festival. This one is happening. His birthday is October the 7th, but we're doing it on October the 4th, and we're raising money for a basket of Ukrainian charities, vpdf.com. There's a crowdfunder too. And the purpose is simply to remind everybody in comfortable Europe and the States, the war continues. The war continues. Ukrainian soldiers are still getting killed. Ukrainian civilians are still getting killed. And also, can we please help Ukraine defend itself? And this is it's non-lethal aid, but there's a basket of Ukrainian charities. And the funny thing, Gavin, is I wrote this book, Killer in the Kremlin, which is a bestseller. So Vladimir Putin pays for his own Vladimir Putin Do Fuck Off Festival.
what do we see, John? When is it like a hay festival with a twist?
It's a panel of people who think that I'm a living god. No, that's a joke. Obviously, it's not the Church of John Sweeney Theology. It's a panel of people who really know their stuff. Former British diplomat Arthur Snell. He's got a lot of interesting connections here. Jimmy Rushton, who knows, I think, he's the Brit who knows more about Ukrainian drones than anyone else, and obviously that's a big topic. Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, wonderful friend Yaroslav Ladygin, who I once asked him, what about this threat of nuclear war? And he said, listen, I'm of the Chernobyl generation. And then our economy got tanked, and then the country we all grown up in, the Soviet Union, collapsed. Then the Russians invaded, then more bad stuff happened, and then the Russians invaded again. So nuclear weapons, nuclear bombs, terrific. So it's a mixture of people who really know about the war and people who really know about the Ukrainian spirit, Ukrainian courage, and everything is shot through like Brighton Rock with the dark, almost anthracite black sense of the Ukrainian sense of humor. They're fighting, and they're not going to stop fighting ever.
Wow. And also usually timed, I think I'm right in saying, around Vladimir Putin's birthday coming up next week. John, we're going to get to that. Not many people have met and been face-to-face, even through surreptitious means, which we'll get onto too, in front of Vladimir Putin. Great to have you with us tonight. Let's go from Kyiv to Antananarivo. Let's bring in France 24 correspondent Gaël Borgia, who was jointly awarded the Pulitzer Prize with the team at the New York Times for her article on Russian interference in Madagascar. Fantastic to have you with us, Gaël, at a time which is very unpredictable where you are. The president taking to Facebook today, claiming a coup attempt is at play, isn't he?
It was quite shocking for the Gen Z, actually, his speech in the middle of the day during the protest. Gen Z immediately reacted on Facebook, mocking him. So we've seen memes and a lot of jokes about his speech. And Gen Z has officially reacted by saying that they are worried about his mental health. And in his speech, he said that they are manipulated by some malintentioned people. He was talking about cyber attacks, about Gen Z being manipulated as if they were not able to think about themselves. And they reacted by saying, we are not robots, we are real human beings, and we can prove it because our blood is you kill us. So we have blood. We are real humans. Wow. So it was quite surprising, this speech for Gen Z.
We're going to get on to what's going on there and in Morocco, and also the unifying flag, the Jolly Roger flag that is cropping up everywhere as well. Great to have you with us tonight, Gaia. Let's move 8,000 kilometres from Antananarivo. Let's go to Florence in Italy. Let's bring in Francesca Borri, the correspondent for the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. Francesca, welcome. Great to have you with us as well. Tell us about your week. You're just back from Syria.
Yes, I've been for a long time mostly in Damascus and actually Yarmouk, because this is the week of October 7th, of course. And Yarmouk is basically downtown Damascus. Before the war, not this war, before the war in Syria, it was the center of Palestinian life outside Palestine, the center, of the diaspora. And it doesn't exist anymore. I mean, it's rubble. It looks like Gaza. It's another Gaza, totally forgotten. There are no plans for reconstructions, and it was basically took over again by Assad in 2018, and so far the rubble is still there. Nobody even removed the rubble. And it's interesting, because all the world is speaking of Palestine and Palestinians, but there are Palestinians completely forgotten. And so it was quite a different angle, because these Palestinians are forgotten by Palestinians, first of all, by Fatah, by Hamas, by UN agencies, by NGOs, by activists, by everybody. And it's quite a significant story.
Francesca, your thoughts are going to be very important tonight. There's a lot going on in the Middle East this week. Great to have you with us too. Well, let's begin to the US Monday, 10 to 3 in the afternoon at the White House, where President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, held a joint press conference, the unveiling of a 20-point plan presented by the President, a plan that would lead to peace in the Middle East, starting with the cessation of hostilities in Gaza. We are beyond very close, he said. Key Arab states backing it, Israel backing it. European leaders were calling him up, he said, to say, quote, "Are you really doing peace in the Middle East?" Yes, said President Trump, except Hamas, who as of Monday were reviewing terms, according to Qatar. The president's ultimatum made clear, accept the plan or face dire consequences. He warned of a, quote, very sad end, and rejection, he said, would see the group pay in hell. Israel would have the full US backing to, quote, finish the job if needed. Benjamin Netanyahu, a spectator for most of the joint conference, added his thoughts.
I support your plan to end the war in Gaza, which achieves our war aims. It will bring back to Israel all our hostages, dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, end its political rule, and ensure that Gaza never again poses a threat to Israel.
There is a reference to a 20-point plan of a potential pathway to Palestinian statehood after the transfer from a board of peace, a transitional authority that's not Hamas. Benjamin Netanyahu said in a video statement released after the conference that Israel would forcibly resist that part. So the momentum of the promising, yet still vague plan already had one sticking point. The next is presumably within the tunnel complex in Gaza. The military commander of Hamas, Iladin al-Haddad, said to have indicated to mediators he doesn't agree because the plan is designed to finish the group, amnesty or not, so he's determined to fight on. Let's begin with you, Francesca. Coming ahead, have you said the 2-year anniversary of the conflict and the Hamas massacre? What's your sense of things where you are and somebody who spends a lot of time in the West Bank and in the Middle East?
Hamas is likely to reply with a conditional yes on Sunday. Morally, not just politically, but morally, whoever is not in Gaza now can't say no to a ceasefire. But the point is, when the peace plan was released, even the Emir of Qatar was quite disappointed, because this is really, not only Hamas, but I would say all Palestinians are cornered, The most controversial points, for Hamas, I would say are two. First of all, the IDF withdrawal from Gaza, because there is in the 20 points, there is no timeline, especially if Hamas, is asked to basically to free all hostages altogether in the first 72 hours. At that point, who will guarantee really, that this withdrawal is going to happen and when and how? And broadly speaking, when it comes to the Israeli side, there are no precise commitments, no obligations, while when it comes to the Hamas and Palestinian side, there are obligations and, consequences for non-compliance. And then, of course, this international administration, I won't even mention, Tony Blair, because as we all know, after the war in Iraq, it's really a name you can't even, pronounce across the Middle East. And it's really, well, for Palestinians, it's, since they still remember the Balfour Declaration, it's quite, it's really a red line. But I would say even without Tony Blair, this international administration, it's, this is not only about Hamas, especially because if you read carefully the plan, for example, this international stabilization force, which should be, an Arab military force, is called a temporary force, and then in the same paragraph, point 15, the plan says this will be the long-term solution for internal security. So, of course, it's not easy for anyone, not just for Hamas, to say yes.
It's interesting, John, just listening to Francesca say she thinks there'll be a conditional yes. The Economist magazine had a front page this week and a headline talking about this, an achievement in itself, that Benjamin Netanyahu was brought to the table. And, some of this plan was probably seen before, echoes of Joe Biden, but he seemed to walk away. What's your take on trying to the sense of everybody being around the table so far, but Hamas?
It's not going to work. You should know that everybody who's British, I lived in Manchester for 5 years when I was a kid, desperately sorry about the killing of 2 Jews in Manchester. That's a ghastly moment, and anti-Semitism is wrong. At the same time, what Israel has been doing under Netanyahu is a genocide. They are murdering a class of school kids every day, or something like that. You can see from the destruction of Gaza that this has been a horribly one-sided thing. Now, yes, Hamas, when they killed more Jews, like more than 1,000 Jews in one day, 1,000 Israeli citizens, that was a terrible thing to do. It was a terrible thing to do. But at the same time, the Israeli reaction since then has been overkill. And just because a madman kills somebody, he does not give you the right to kill the madman's children. And Netanyahu is a thief who is trying to avoid prison by by prolonging the war. He's a bit like Putin. Neither Putin nor Netanyahu can stop their separate wars. And Netanyahu is a war criminal. And Trump has made a great strategic mistake because he said to Hamas, you've got to sign up to this, or else I'll give Netanyahu free rein to do whatever he wants to do next. And that's a great strategic mistake. So I don't see how this works, because the previous correspondent was, exactly right, that the Israelis are not bound by any of these terms. They're all a bit vague as far as what the Israelis have got to do, but Hamas has got to surrender the hostages. So that they're not going to do that, and therefore the war will continue. But this time the war continues with Trump having said, okay, I'm going to back the Israelis. Now, the problem fundamentally is that Trump is terrible at detail, but also that America and American power has consistently failed to stand up to Israeli war crimes. And we're all familiar with what happened in the Holocaust. That was terrible, humanity's darkest hour. But that does not give Netanyahu the right to carry on in the way that he's doing. Israel should stop what they're doing, and they should try and seek a two-state solution, and they should try and stop the cycle of violence. And this deal isn't going to deliver that.
I put a couple of points to Vivienne, John. So a couple of points. First of all, on the case of genocide, we know that a UN Human Rights Council independent report commission found 4 acts of genocide. The UN hasn't and doesn't give a opinion on that. We are waiting for the ICJ case, the International Court of Justice, that South Africa is bringing, which is denied by Israel. That may take some time. And the other point, which Francesca point, was on Tony Blair, saying he's deeply unpopular. He's not unpopular with the Israelis. They seem to be pushing him forward, including Jared Kushner. So on those 2 points, first of all, whether you believe, from contacts and time you've spent in the Middle East, that this is better than, well, the lack of anything else right now, and where you see this going.
I mean, it's tempting to say, yes, of course, anything is better than what's going on right now. People are desperate for some kind of ceasefire. But this is not a ceasefire. This is an ultimatum. When you put somebody up against the wall, there's nowhere for them to go. And the problem with this is not a deal. It's just a document. It's a one-sided document. It's completely front-loaded. It basically says release all the hostages. So in other words, all the people who've been fighting for 2 years in Gaza have no more bargaining chips. So I agree with John. I think it's unworkable. There's as much left out as there is put in. Of course, there is no path to Palestinian statehood, which is something that ultimately no Arab country is going to sign on to. So I don't know what Trump is talking about when he says, everybody loves this deal. He has his own timetable with his, quest for the Nobel Peace Prize. And, Netanyahu also has his timetable with elections coming up in a few weeks' time in Israel. So it seems to me like they're rushing this through. It's completely half-baked and it's totally one-sided.
Vivienne, that takes us nicely and neatly as we wait for this Sunday deadline to events on Wednesday morning to Christiansborg, Copenhagen, the home of the Danish Parliament, and also the royal reception where 47 European leaders gathered from the European political community. A group set up in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine to cooperate on security and defence, and in this case communicate quickly in the face of a threat and perceived aggression from the Kremlin, coming days after suspected Russian drones, actual Russian MiG fighter jets violating the airspace of the Baltic states and Denmark and possibly Germany too, claims denied by the Kremlin. It's an EU plus group, the plus being the UK, Norway, Turkey, Eastern European nations with more close or complex relations with Moscow, Serbia, Georgia, Azerbaijan. So a strategic check is how it was described. Although, with the group so large, any political commitment was unlikely. The decision-making came from an informal meeting. These people, the EU leaders on the sidelines. It was the moment that the EU Commission chief, Ursula von der Leyen, chose to formally launch the idea of a drone war, an interception system developed in order to protect the eastern borders of Europe. To fund it, up to 150 billion euros of defence loans will be distributed to 10 countries close to the Russian border. This is where the cracks start to show in the whole drone wall concept. The French and Germans are wary. They're teaming up to build a more generic early warning system. Same too for the Belgians, Italians, the Greek government, who believe the eastern flank is too specific. The whole of Europe should be the focus. And this was quickly picked up on in this meeting by reporters who asked the Danish Prime Minister why she wouldn't use the word drone war. She had no problem, she said, and went on to explain her issue.
Technology is changing so rapidly that we cannot have one idea and believe that that will solve all our problems. So I like the idea of a drone wall, but we have to be very frank to the Europeans that no matter what kind of capabilities we are able to buy, to innovate, to build up, there will still be drones coming into Europe.
Meanwhile, it's been reported this week that Ukraine could be about to receive US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, known for long-range accuracy that could strike deep into Russia, including reaching Moscow. Military bases, airfields are currently out of reach. President Putin, as you can see here, gave a press conference in Sochi on Thursday, said the potential supply would, quote, be a qualitative new stage of escalation. Let's begin with John in Kyiv. Let's start with the Tomahawks, John. A qualitative new stage of escalation, says Putin, saying it will not change the balance of force on the battlefield. What do you make of that?
He might be right about that. The big thing about the war now is the drones. And what the drones mean is that neither side can hide an army from the other side, and that really helps Ukraine. So Russia's problem is that it cannot get a massive force close to the front line before the Ukrainians see it and then knock out the supplies and knock out the soldiers. And they're doing this again and again. And the Ukrainians have become really, really good at this. And they're rewriting every single textbook about how armies fight. And the West, Britain, America, are way behind, way behind. We need to learn from the Ukrainians. So Putin might be right in saying that Tomahawks aren't a great game changer. Okay, but he's in trouble because what the Ukrainians are now doing is they've worked out the critical bit of any oil refinery is the cat cracker, which is essentially it's a kettle made of high precision steel. And the Ukrainians have knocked out something like 38% of Russia's refining capacity. And that means that Vladimir Putin is running out of money to fight his war. Now, so remember, what happens in Russia is that Russia has been paying ordinary farm boys from Siberia, from Russia, from wherever, $20,000, $30,000, sometimes $50,000 to join the Russian army. The Ukrainians pay very, very little because Ukrainians are patriotic, while the Russians are mercenaries, because this isn't their war and they shouldn't be in Ukraine. So where this sits is that I think Putin's in trouble, and I think what he's now trying to do is to spook the Europeans and the British by doing a number of things. Russian drones have hit the power station that serves Chernobyl, and yes, I know one of the nuclear kettles got blown up, but there are 3 reactors that are still bubbling along at low power. Now, what's happened is the Russians have knocked out the power station, so they're now being run on diesel generators. That's not good. And also the same thing down south. The Russians have got control of a big Ukrainian nuclear reactor in Zaporizhia, and they're messing around with that too. Separately, just as your news led with the drone attack on Munich airport. Who did that? The Russians. The Russians. No one else. The Russians. So what's happening is they're trying to spook Europe because Europe's getting close to doing a clever and good thing, in which they say, we're going to take the $200 billion of Russian gold, which is stuck in a kind of central banky deposit thing in Belgium. I'm going to use that as collateral for loans to help Ukraine win the war and to rebuild itself. And Putin hates this.
Yes.
And what he's trying to do is to spook the whole of Europe to stop it. So from now on, we should see more and more drone attacks in Europe and more pressure on European democracies from within, because Russia's trying to get traitors to do its bidding. But all of this means Putin's in trouble.
You've taken us on a very nice pod history of the past 7 days of a number of issues. One, as you say, that money in Brussels, the frozen Russian assets, big concern, including from Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, wondering if there's going to be legal implications for him if they start to allow this money to be used as a loan to Ukraine. You also mentioned, John, Vivian, listening to that, about the gas problems, which are being reported for the first time, actually, not with the bigger companies, but independent companies, because of those drone attacks from Ukraine at the refineries, when it's meant they've stopped the exports to some of the former Soviet satellites of the Stans. Kyrgyzstan relies on 90% of Russian gas. So there's a kind of alert level here which President Trump will no doubt be aware of. Now, going back to John's original point, where we talked about the drone warfare here, are there cracks you're seeing in terms of how they're working it? Is that a problem that Europe's got at the moment? Where the priority should be?
In a sense, what's so ironic, and sort of John tapped on, sort of mentioned how far behind the West is in some ways. You have all of this emerging just as the US military, the biggest military in the world, puts on this ridiculous show where they fly in all the generals, including generals from hotspots around Europe, to listen to a kind of pep talk about beards and battleships. They want more battleships. It's just not what a battlefield now looks like. And what's so frustrating about watching the summit in Copenhagen is that when you're in Europe, you really feel the sense that this could be a very hot war in the middle of Europe. I mean, there is a hot war, of course, in Ukraine, but that this has the potential to really spread quickly. And here you have this kind of intellectual symmetry going on and the kind of bravado going on in Washington. It seems to me very kind of off kilter in a way. And you mentioned the gas problem. I just read today, in fact, that Russia has cut its defense budget for the first time in years, signaling the fact that the economy is in bad shape. If they're cutting their defense budget in the middle of the war, there is clearly a lot of problems that aren't publicly known.
Francesca, listening to John, to Vivian, I'm just quite minded. We don't often ask about this, just the positions of certain European leaders. How do you see Giorgia Meloni's kind of position within all of this at the moment? How does she set herself within the Ukraine debate?
Wherever Trump is, Giorgia Meloni is there. It's very, very clear. Even against sometimes, the interest of Italy. And yes, especially when it comes to Ukraine, Giorgia Meloni is absolutely, behind Ukraine, with Ukraine, and very clearly, cynically, I would say, that as Europeans, we should press, Netanyahu to stop the war in Gaza, because we are really overlooking, and forgetting what's happening in Ukraine, and which is really, really dangerous, because not only we don't have, a common defense, but we all know that we don't have a common foreign policy, so you can't have defense without a foreign policy. And somehow, when I watch Ukraine, I remind, when I'm reminded of Syria, when, I'm a frontline reporter, I'm a war reporter, and I was in Syria most of the war. And basically, Turkey especially, and the Arab countries that were supporting the rebels against Assad did more or less what we did with Ukraine, which means harming, the rebels, basically to defend themselves, but not enough to win, not enough to prevail. And in this way, of course, the war lasted, 14 years, and now militarily, you have to win, or you have to, defend yourself and start a political process. What we didn't do, we didn't start any political process. So after, so much time, it's time to start a political process. Otherwise, just helping Ukraine to defend itself will lead nowhere.
Yes. It's a good point. John, just listening to that, I'm also minded, I want to take you back to 2014, your reflections of 11 years ago, because people might watch you and might remember, because it went around the world what you did. You kind of doorstepped and briefly interviewed President Putin, surreptitiously. You stood there in a queue, and only the interview, I think, exists right now on YouTube, as far as I can see, not the beginning bit. Let's just take a look, and I want you to explain afterwards the run-up to this moment.
What is the essence of the tragedy that is happening now in Ukraine? I think the main reason is that the Kiev authorities do not want to conduct substantive political dialogue with the east of the country. And now is the beginning of a very important process, in my view, the process of direct negotiations.
Two thoughts, John. How has that response aged 11 years on? And there was a fair amount of subterfuge that took to get that, wasn't it?
Yeah, I reported on the shooting down of MH17, in which 298 people were shot out of the sky by a Russian Buk missile. They thought they were looking at a Ukrainian fighter jet, but they took down MH17. I went out and I saw the dead bodies, and I saw ladies' hats, paperbacks, engines, nose cone, and trunkies, the little things that toddlers carried along, the little suitcases that toddlers are carried along by mum and dad. And whenever I see one to this day at Gatwick or Stansted, it makes me cry. And let's try and doorstep Putin. It's impossible. The BBC Panorama colleagues said it's impossible. And you can't do it in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Somebody else said you can do it in the sticks. Somebody else said he's opening a mammoth museum in Siberia. And the editor of Panorama said, have we got any reporters that look like a professor of mammothology? And that was me. So you can tell, anyway, I've been to my niece's wedding. I was wearing a wedding suit. I got some wine stains on that suit. And I looked exactly like all the other kind of Paleolithic mammothology professors. And when Putin rocked up, and he always pimp rolls in like a kind of grubby, the little bouncer you should be afraid of in the nightclub. He pimp rolls in, and I say, John Sweeney from BBC Panorama, what about the killings in Ukraine? And all of the Kremlin media thought this had been pre-agreed, preordained. And so Putin had to answer. And what he does is he lied and lied and lied. By the way, Yakutsk is 9 time zones east of London. And I write about this in my book, Killer in the Kremlin, but I was hungry. I got off the plane in Yakutsk and I hit a kebab. I wolfed the kebab. And as he's talking to me, and he's little, he's almost 5'6", and I'm 5'11". And the kebab was wrong. There was something squiffy about it, and it's bubbling up my stomach. And what you don't see in the picture is I'm worried that I'm about to go
I see.
all over Vladimir Putin. And I don't. And all of my Ukrainian pals say, what? You could have thrown up over Putin. What's wrong with you? Anyway, 3 hours later, somebody came up to me and punched me in the stomach.
Wow. Wow.
The Russians, the Kremlin didn't like my question, which is, by the way, the reason why people in Ukraine are fighting because they like free speech, they like democracy, they like the rule of law, they like the idea that they can live their lives without listening to some boring politician going on all the time.
It also strikes me there probably won't be many professors of mammothology in future that he spends any time with. Fool me once, as George Bush said. What an incredible story, John. Well, let's move from Putin and let's look at what's going on in Morocco, Madagascar this week. Parallel protests, 8,000 kilometres apart, both movements calling for change, both organised on social media, both inspired by recent youth-led movements in Nepal, Indonesia and Kenya too. First Morocco, the group called Gen212, a Morocco youth voice leading street protests for 7 days in a row. The focus, better healthcare, triggered by reported deaths of 8 women during childbirth at a public hospital in Agadir. Anger exacerbated by allegations of government corruption, overspend at football stadiums for the 2030 World Cup. These protests spreading to towns and cities. As one sign read in Rabat, at least FIFA stadiums will have a first aid kit, our hospitals don't. Police are accusing the protesters of rioting and looting. At least 2 people have been killed in clashes, and the government denies the corruption claims.
Politicians keep asking people to control themselves, to be patient, to make sacrifices, to act as good citizens and love their country, but they don't do any of this themselves. They see the country boiling, yet they haven't made a single public statement. At least say something, even if it's just a lie.
And on the island of Madagascar, one of the poorest countries in the world, the rolling protest started 9 days ago. Lack of basic services, constant power blackouts, water cuts that happened for up to 12 hours a day. Anger mirrored and stirred online with protesters on TikTok pointing to high-profile projects the government's invested in, such as $152 billion for a cable car in the capital, Antananarivo. Viral videos highlighting the luxury and seemingly nepotistic lifestyles of the children of the elite. The president claimed on Facebook it wasn't a demo, it was an attempted coup. Well, police have been using excessive force. That's the accusation from demonstrators. The UN says at least 22 people have been killed. Again, police saying protesters looting, rioting. So the president, André Rajoelina, dissolved his government on Monday. Demonstrators want him gone. And as I said, as we heard earlier, he suggests it's a big coup from outside agents.
There are associations, there are agencies, and countries that finance this movement. And there are those who plan to seize power without going through elections. They simply want to take power and seek only to exploit Madagascar's mines, as in other African countries.
Gael, talk us through what's going on, what the protesters want to achieve, and whether you feel like at the moment where it's heading, are they close to achieving it?
What's funny is that they never talk about dark forces from abroad trying to attempt a coup or trying to exploit Madagascar. It's not what they say. The main thing we hear, and I've heard it today as well, it's we want him to resign. That's the main message from GenZ protesters. But it's an argument like often used by the authorities, accusing the opposition, accusing people without saying who are manipulating young people. So it's we kind of used to those arguments.
Have you been sort of taken aback by the speed that this has spread, the amount of people multiplying using Discord, using TikTok, and also I just want to mention this shared flag and how often you're seeing it, because we're seeing this cropping up not just in Morocco but Indonesia and Nepal as well. This is the Japanese manga created cartoon. It's called the Straw Hat Pirates Jolly Roger. It's a symbol of resistance. There it is. It's based on a Japanese comic series called One Piece, and a character called Luffy who battles tyrannical governments. This is something that I think is popped up around. Tell us about that, and tell us about the speed of movement online that you're seeing.
this flag had never been used before. I've seen it just a few days before the first day of protest. So this is totally new. It's the first time we see so many young people taken to the street, so many young people being who openly criticize the leaders, the president, because for years people didn't dare say anything. It looked like they were silenced, and it was difficult for me, for example, to have interviews. Like people didn't dare talking. So it's really surprising to see now so many people being frank. Like they are not scared anymore to criticize the government, to talk directly to the president. So this is totally new, and no one expected that in Madagascar.
Well, great to hear, and we're going to keep across that with you throughout the weekend as well. Gaël Borgia, our correspondent, thank you to this week's distinguished panel. Clear clarity, experience, unique insight that is needed now more than ever. In the studio with me, Vivian Waltz, thank you. Long-time correspondent for Time magazine. Thank you to Gaël Borgia, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, France 24 correspondent in Madagascar. Francesca Burri, correspondent for La Repubblica in Florence and in the Ukrainian capital. Thank you to John Sweeney, broadcaster, journalist and founder of the Vladimir Putin Do Off Festival, taking place this weekend. Thank you, John. And thank you for watching in a week that the world said goodbye to Jane Goodall, renowned primatologist and conservationist whose chimpanzee research in Tanzania's Gobi Stream National Park revolutionised understanding of animal behaviour. She died on Wednesday, aged 91. And we've just heard of the death of the British actress Patricia Routledge, who died today, aged 96. A champion she was of getting older, she said, in what she called the treasure years, citing the fact she got the part of Hyacinth Bouquet, aged 50, learned Italian at 60, to sing opera at 70, returned to the Shakespearean stage and took up watercolour at 80. She wrote, "Growing older is not the closing act. It can be the most exquisite chapter." Here she is as Kitty in As Seen on TV in 1985. We will see you in 7 days for The World Next Week.
Oh, well, I don't know where to start. I was in the cafeteria here, and a woman sat down with a prune yoghurt, and her speakers are fine, so I said, "What's that terrible smell?"